I've lost everything.
David Bennett stood outside the house he had shared with his wife for 9 years, holding a manila envelope in one hand and his wedding ring in the other. It was just after 7 in the morning, and the street was still quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a man feel every single heartbeat in his own chest. 3 weeks earlier, he had buried his father. Now he was standing on the porch of a home that no longer felt like his, reading 2 words that would end the only version of his life he had ever known: divorce papers. His wife of 9 years wanted out, and she wanted out fast. What David did not know that morning, what almost no one in his life knew, was that his father had not simply been a quiet, hard-working man who spent his final years fixing cars and mowing his own lawn. His father had been sitting on a fortune so large that even the lawyers who managed it had signed agreements never to speak of it outside a locked office in downtown Columbus. For over 20 years, Harold Bennett had built a second life in complete silence. And he had done it for one reason only: to protect the one person he loved more than anything in this world, his son. Sarah Mitchell, David's wife, did not know any of this either, at least not at first. She had married David when he had nothing but a modest paycheck, and a father everyone assumed was just another aging factory worker. For years, money had been tight, arguments had been frequent, and love, or whatever was left of it, had quietly worn thin. But something changed the moment Harold Bennett's casket was lowered into the ground. Within 3 weeks, Sarah was gone, and she was not alone. She had moved in with David's closest friend since childhood, a man named Mark Coleman, the same man who had stood beside David on his wedding day and held his hand at his father's funeral. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked like a simple, painful story. A grieving husband, an impatient wife, a best friend who could not resist temptation. But there was a piece of this story that no one outside a small, private law office had ever heard. A piece that was about to turn David Bennett from a man who had lost everything into a man who quietly held all the power. Because 3 weeks after his wife walked out the door with nothing but her clothes and her pride, a lawyer called David and asked him to come in for a reading his father had specifically requested be delayed. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a man who appeared to lose his marriage, his best friend, and his father, in the very same season, ended up holding a secret so large, it would eventually bring both of those people crawling back to his door. You will understand why Sarah left when she did, and not one single day earlier. You will understand what Mark Coleman knew, and how long he had known it. And you will understand why Harold Bennett spent 20 years building a fortune in total silence, and why he chose the darkest weeks of his son's life to finally let it be known. Sarah Mitchell had spent 9 years by David Bennett's side, and to most people who knew them, she had always seemed like the more grounded one, the one who kept the household together while David worked long hours at a job that barely covered the bills. Friends and family assumed her decision to leave so soon after Harold Bennett's death was simply a matter of bad timing, colliding with bad judgment, the kind of thing people whisper about at church and then forget within a season. But there was a question nobody in that small Ohio town had thought to ask out loud. A question that would only make sense once every piece of this story was finally laid out in order. Why did Sarah choose to leave the very moment David had nothing left, instead of years earlier when the marriage was already struggling? Then there was Mark Coleman, the man David had trusted since they were both 9 years old, riding bikes down the same gravel road. Mark had been in David's wedding photos, had sat beside him in the hospital waiting room the night Harold Bennett had his first heart scare, had eaten dinner at that kitchen table more times than either man could count. For Mark to end up with Sarah was not just a betrayal of a marriage, it was a betrayal of an entire childhood. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. What exactly did Mark know, and when did he know it, that made him willing to destroy a friendship that had lasted almost 30 years? And finally, there is Harold Bennett himself, a man who spent 2 decades hiding a fortune from the very people who loved him most. He drove an old pickup truck. He wore the same winter coat for 15 years. He never once let his son suspect that the quiet, unremarkable life they lived together was a carefully built disguise. What was Harold protecting his son from? And why did he wait until the darkest, most painful weeks of David's life to finally let the truth come out? These 3 questions sit at the center of everything that is about to unfold, and by the time this story reaches its end, every single one of them will be answered in a way you will not see coming. David Bennett grew up in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of town, the only child of Harold and Linda Bennett. His mother passed away when he was just 14, leaving Harold to raise him alone. And from that point forward, It was just the two of them against whatever the world had to offer. Harold worked long shifts, first at a manufacturing plant, and later, once David was grown, at what he always described as a small consulting job that kept him traveling more than either of them liked. David never questioned it. Fathers worked. Fathers came home tired. That was simply the shape of the life he knew, and he never once imagined there was anything hidden underneath it. What David did notice, though he never thought much of it at the time, were the small inconsistencies that quietly followed his father through the years. Harold would disappear for a week at a time and come back saying almost nothing about where he had been. He kept a drawer in his study locked at all times, even though the rest of the house was left open and unguarded. He paid for David's college tuition in full, in cash, at a time when David assumed his father was barely scraping by. When David asked questions, Harold would smile, change the subject, and remind his son that some things were simply not worth worrying about. David loved his father too much to push, and so he let those small, strange moments pass without ever putting them together. By the time David met Sarah Mitchell, he was 26 years old, working a steady but unremarkable job in logistics, and looking for exactly the kind of stability his own childhood had lacked. Sarah was warm, quick to laugh, and seemed genuinely drawn to the honesty David carried with him, the same honesty his father had instilled in him growing up. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony that Harold quietly paid for without ever mentioning the cost. In the early years, money was tight, and there were nights David and Sarah argued about bills at the kitchen table, the same way most young couples do. Neither of them ever suspected that one man sitting quietly at the head of that same table held the answer to every financial worry they had ever had. Mark Coleman had been part of David's life even longer than Sarah had. The two boys grew up 2 houses apart, rode the same bus to school, and spent nearly every summer of their childhood fishing at the same lake outside town. When David's mother died, Mark was the one who sat with him on the porch for hours without saying a word, simply staying close, so David would not have to be alone. He stood beside David at his wedding, gave a toast that made the entire room laugh and cry in the same breath, and became, over the years, something closer to a brother than a friend. Nobody watching the three of them together, David, Sarah, and Mark, would have guessed that one quiet, unremarkable inheritance would eventually turn 2 of the closest relationships in David's life into the very thing that nearly destroyed him. There was one detail from those years that David would only understand much later, a detail so small it barely registered at the time. A few months before Harold's health began to decline, Mark had taken on a short consulting project through his work, helping a private firm review some real estate paperwork downtown. He never mentioned the name of the firm to David, and David never thought to ask. It was, at the time, simply one more unremarkable afternoon in a friendship built on thousands of them. It would be nearly 2 years before David understood exactly whose paperwork Mark had been reviewing that day, and by then, the damage of that single afternoon had already quietly reshaped all 3 of their lives. Harold Bennett's health had never been perfect, but nothing about that Tuesday morning suggested it would be his last. He had spent the previous afternoon exactly as he spent most afternoons, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the same gravel road he used to walk with David 3 decades earlier. David had called him that evening, the two of them talking for almost 20 minutes about nothing in particular, the kind of easy, unremarkable conversation fathers and sons have 1,000 times over a lifetime without ever imagining it could be the last one. Harold passed away quietly in his sleep that night, and it was David who found him the next morning, when his father did not answer the phone. The days that followed moved in the strange, disjointed way grief tends to move, full of phone calls, paperwork, and a kind of numbness David had never experienced even after losing his mother. Sarah stayed close during those first days, handling arrangements, greeting relatives at the door, playing the role of a devoted, grieving daughter-in-law so convincingly that not a single person in David's family ever thought to question her. Mark was there too, helping carry the casket, standing beside David at the front of the funeral home, gripping his shoulder, the way he had done so many times since they were boys. To anyone watching, it looked like David was surrounded by exactly the people he needed most in the hardest week of his life. The funeral itself drew a modest crowd, mostly neighbors, a handful of co-workers from Harold's old manufacturing job, and a few distant relatives David barely recognized. But near the back of the room, seated alone and dressed far more formally than anyone else in attendance, sat a man none of them knew. He did not speak to anyone, did not sign the guest book, and left quietly before the service had even fully ended. David noticed him only once, for a brief moment, and assumed he was simply an old coworker paying his respects. He would not learn the man's name, or his purpose, until several weeks later, and by then, that brief, forgettable moment at the back of the funeral home would take on a meaning David never could have predicted. A little over a week after the funeral, Harold's modest estate was settled in a short, unremarkable meeting at a local law office. The house, a small savings account, an old pickup truck, nothing that surprised anyone in the room. Sarah sat beside David during that meeting, and those who noticed her expression that day would later describe it as quiet, controlled disappointment, though at the time, it seemed like nothing more than the natural exhaustion of a difficult month. Everyone in David's life walked away from that meeting believing the story of Harold Bennett's estate was finished. A simple, humble ending to a simple, humble life. They were wrong, because 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived at David's door. One Harold had arranged, long before his death, to be delivered only after every other piece of business had quietly closed. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, plain and unremarkable, addressed in a handwriting David recognized instantly as his father's. Inside was a short note asking him to come alone to a law office in downtown Columbus, one David had never heard mentioned in his entire life, and to bring nothing but a form of identification. There was no explanation, no warning of what waited for him, only a single line at the bottom of the page that stayed with David the entire drive into the city. It read, "If you are reading this, then everything I could not tell you while I was alive is finally yours to know." David sat with that envelope on the passenger seat for 3 days before he found the courage to make the call. The office David walked into 2 days later looked nothing like the modest law firm that had handled his father's simple estate weeks earlier. It occupied an entire floor of a downtown building, quiet and understated in the way that only genuine wealth tends to be. A man named Gerald Whitfield greeted him, introduced himself as the estate attorney who had managed Harold Bennett's private holdings for over 18 years, and asked David to sit down before saying another word. What followed was a conversation David would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. A slow, careful explanation of a fortune built quietly across 2 decades through real estate holdings, private investments, and a handful of businesses that operated under names David had never once heard his father mention. Harold Bennett had never wanted to be a rich man in the eyes of the world. He had built and structured everything specifically so that no one, not neighbors, not extended family, not even his own son, would ever know the scale of what he had accumulated until he decided the time was right. Gerald explained that Harold had left explicit instructions for the reveal to happen exactly the way it did, quietly, privately, and only after the simple public estate had already been settled and closed. David sat in stunned silence as the numbers were read aloud to him, a sum so large it did not feel real, attached to a father he thought he had known completely. What David did not know, sitting in that office trying to process the impossible, was that word of Harold Bennett's true fortune had already begun to move through a much smaller circle than anyone realized. Weeks earlier, before Harold's death, a private firm downtown had been quietly retained to review certain real estate holdings tied to an aging client who wished to remain anonymous. It was routine work, the kind handled by dozens of young professionals across the city every single year, and the man assigned to review a portion of that paperwork had no idea at the time whose name sat buried inside those documents. That man was Mark Coleman, and the afternoon he spent reviewing those papers would end up changing the course of 3 lives long before David ever received his letter. Within days of David's meeting with Gerald Whitfield, Sarah's behavior began to shift in ways David could not immediately explain. The divorce meetings she had been pushing so aggressively suddenly slowed. Phone calls that once ended coldly now lingered a little longer. A woman who 3 weeks earlier had walked out the door with nothing but her clothes and her pride was suddenly sending messages asking if they could talk, if there was still a chance to work things out, if David would consider meeting somewhere quiet and private. At first, David allowed himself to believe this was simple grief working its way through both of them, 2 people who had lost their footing and were slowly trying to find it again. It would take him longer than he would like to admit to understand what had truly changed in those 3 weeks, and why. Determined to understand his father's hidden life, David spent the following weeks quietly retracing Harold's steps, speaking with former business associates, an old assistant who had helped manage correspondence for over a decade, and a property manager who oversaw one of Harold's largest holdings without ever having met him in person. Piece by piece, a picture began to form of a man who had spent 20 years building something extraordinary in complete silence, all while living in the same modest house, driving the same old truck, and never once letting his guard down in front of the one person he loved most. And somewhere in that same stretch of weeks, David finally learned the name of the private firm that had reviewed his father's real estate holdings months before his death, a discovery that would connect two people in his life he never imagined belonged in the same sentence. The name on the firm's client intake sheet stopped David cold the moment he saw it. Mark Coleman, the same Mark Coleman who had carried his father's casket, who had stood beside him at his wedding, who had sat with him on a porch the night his mother died, had spent an entire afternoon, nearly 2 years earlier, reviewing paperwork tied directly to Harold Bennett's private real estate holdings. It had been routine work, buried under a dozen other files that same month, the kind of assignment a junior associate forgets within a week. But somewhere in that stack of documents, Mark had come across a name he recognized immediately, and a number attached to it that no amount of professional discretion could make him forget. David confronted Mark directly, sitting across from him in the same kitchen where the two of them had eaten dinner more times than either could count. Mark did not deny it. He explained, haltingly at first, and then with the exhausted honesty of a man who had been carrying a secret far too heavy for far too long, that he had recognized Harold's name on those documents and understood almost immediately the scale of what his best friend's father was quietly sitting on. He told David he never intended to say a word to anyone, that he had convinced himself the secret was not his to share. But somewhere between that afternoon and the week of Harold's funeral, in a moment of weakness he still could not fully explain, he had told Sarah. It had not happened all at once. Mark described a slow unraveling. A conversation here, a comment there. Small pieces of information that Sarah pulled from him over months without either of them ever naming out loud what they were really discussing. By the time Harold Bennett passed away, Sarah understood more about her father-in-law's true financial position than David himself did. She watched the small, modest estate meeting unfold exactly as everyone expected, quiet and unremarkable, and she assumed, reasonably, that whatever fortune Mark had described to her either did not exist or had already been distributed somewhere David would never trace. It was only after David's meeting with Gerald Whitfield, once whispers of a second, much larger inheritance began moving through the small circle of people who managed Harold's affairs, that Sarah understood her timing had been catastrophically wrong. She had filed for divorce, believing the money was gone, believing David was simply an ordinary man with an ordinary inheritance, and that whatever future she wanted for herself would have to be built somewhere else, with someone else. Mark, carrying the weight of a secret he never should have shared, had quietly become that someone else, and in the confusion and grief of those first weeks, neither of them had considered the possibility that Harold Bennett's true fortune was still waiting, patiently, to reveal itself on his own terms. When it finally did, Sarah did not see it as too late. She saw it as a mistake that could still be corrected, and she began working, quietly and carefully, to find her way back into David's life, before he understood exactly how she had gotten there in the first place. David sat with everything he had learned for nearly 2 weeks before he decided what to do with it. He thought about the 9 years he had spent building a life with Sarah, the small kitchen arguments over bills neither of them could afford, the quiet comfort he had always found in Mark's friendship since they were boys riding bikes down the same gravel road. None of that history disappeared simply because of what he now understood, but it sat differently in his memory, colored by the knowledge that the two people closest to him had quietly known something about his own father that he himself had not, and had chosen, for months, to say nothing at all. When Sarah finally asked to meet him in person, David agreed, not out of hope for reconciliation, but because he wanted to hear, directly from her, whether she would tell him the truth if given the chance. She did not. She spoke of grief, of confusion, of a marriage she had never truly stopped believing in, and never once mentioned Mark, the firm, or the months she had spent quietly gathering information about a fortune she assumed had already slipped away. It was that omission, more than anything Mark had already confessed, that told David everything he needed to know about what this reconciliation attempt had actually been built on. David chose not to confront her with what he knew in that moment. Instead, he thanked her calmly for coming, told her he needed time, and walked away from that meeting having already made his decision. In the following weeks, He finalized the divorce on his own terms, quietly and without public confrontation, choosing not to expose what Mark had told him to family or friends, who would have gladly turned it into a spectacle. He ended his friendship with Mark the same way, with a short, private conversation, rather than a dramatic reckoning, telling him only that some decisions cannot be undone by an apology, no matter how long the friendship behind them. Sarah and Mark's relationship did not survive the months that followed. Built on a secret rather than genuine trust, it collapsed under the same weight that had created it in the first place. Each of them left to reckon separately, with a choice that had cost them far more than either had gained. David, meanwhile, spent that first year quietly learning to manage the fortune his father had spent 2 decades protecting, working closely with Gerald Whitfield to understand not just the numbers, but the values his father had clearly built the entire structure around: patience, discretion, and a deep unwillingness to let money define the people closest to him. In the end, this was never really a story about a hidden fortune. It was a story about which people in David Bennett's life valued him for who he was, and which ones only discovered his worth once a number was attached to it. Harold Bennett understood that better than anyone, and it is likely the exact reason he waited until the darkest, most painful weeks of his son's life to finally let the truth come out. It was, in its own quiet way, the last lesson he ever taught him. Would you have seen the signs before David did? And which betrayal do you think cuts deeper? The one from a spouse or the one from a lifelong friend? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story of betrayal, fortune, and quiet justice kept you watching until the very end, wait until you hear what happened when another woman's secret nearly cost her everything she never even knew she had. Subscribe now so you never miss the next story.